It's good that we're there now saying we need to limit the amount of aviation. The question now is how we share out the flights that we can take more fairly, and that does mean targeting those 15% of people who take 70% of all flights.
We were the cradle of the last industrial revolution. We could be there at the start of this new industrial revolution as well if we tap into that potential.
There has to be a much more efficient link-up of the Eurostar rail service with the whole of the rest of Europe in order to reduce the number of short-haul flights that go to Europe. And there has to be an expansion of our rail network all across the country if we're to get people to use trains rather than flights, and also make the train fares cheaper so that it's actually a real offer and option for everybody in this country.
When I was growing up in the 1980s, the big challenge that we were thinking about was the hole in the ozone layer and how we were going to deal with that and all of the negative impacts that had. What gives me hope is that international action was taken. Governments got together and agreed. CFCs were cut by 98%, and the hole in the ozone layer is now the smallest it has been for 30 years and looks like it will repair. That shows me that we can solve this problem.
As well, I grew up in the west of Scotland in the 1980s. I saw the effects of deindustrialisation and leaving people behind. The legacy of that is still there in too many of our communities, and we can't make that mistake again.
Let's start with short opening statements from the leaders in alphabetical order, starting with the co-leader of the Green Party, Sian Berry.
Tonight, this is what you'll see. Every leader on this stage will agree with me. They will all work hard to sound a little bit like the Green Party. Some might even sound convincing. It's progress, but as you watch, ask yourself two important questions. Do their plans match the scale of the emergency we face, and do you trust them to get this done without more Greens in Parliament making sure of it?
Thank you. And next, Jeremy Corbyn.
This election is our last chance to tackle the climate and environment emergency. The climate movement has changed our politics forever, and Labour has listened. Just 100 companies are responsible for 70% of emissions. And you at home must not pay the price of the transition to a net zero economy. Labour will kickstart a green industrial revolution.
As a new father, the climate crisis feels personal now. My son is only one, but one day soon he's going to ask me, "You had power, so what did you do?" What I want to do is to combine hope with urgency, to make a trinity of zeros: zero carbon, zero waste, zero poverty, our common goal by 2030, to turn Wales into the world's testbed.
Tackling the global climate emergency is a moral obligation, and Scotland is already leading the way. We have almost halved our emissions and now set a new legal target to reach net zero of all emissions by 2045, 5 years ahead of the rest of the UK.
The climate crisis is even more important than Brexit. But Brexit is a climate crime. It is morally wrong to leave our seat at the table and give up our influence to create the change we need right across the world. We have two paths ahead of us. One where our children inherit a poisoned planet, or one where our children breathe clean air, where going green is the easier, cheaper option, where we protect our planet for future generations. Absolutely possible to get there by 2045, but we should do this as quickly as we can.
So you're less ambitious?
No, because we should do it as quickly as we can and bring that date forward. But the important thing is not only when we get to net zero, it's how quickly we cut emissions right now, how much carbon we take out of the atmosphere right now. That is what is going to give us the best chance of saving our planet. But can I inject a note of optimism? Because I noticed in your film at the beginning, you know, the fate of that koala at the end of it perhaps was, you know, a bit of a somber note. And often in these climate discussions, that can be how it feels. It can feel impossible. When I was growing up in the 1980s, the big challenge that we were thinking about was the hole in the ozone layer and how we were going to deal with that and all of the negative impacts that had. What gives me hope is that international action was taken. Governments got together and agreed. CFCs were cut by 98%, and the hole in the ozone layer is now the smallest it has been for 30 years and looks like it will repair. That shows me that we can solve this problem.
Sian, do you need to show leadership and say to people, you've got to eat less Aberdeen Angus and say to your farmers, you're going to have to sell
We've got
this.
to make sure that the food that we are producing is produced in a way that is more environmentally friendly. There's a lot of work ongoing to do that right now. But for environmental reasons and for health reasons, yes, of course, we've got to be encouraging people to eat balanced diets and to think about getting their food much more locally sourced. That's good for the economy as well as being good for people's health and good for the environment.
I think meat consumption is falling anyway, and more people are recognising that you need a balanced diet. It doesn't mean everybody's got to become a vegetarian tomorrow, and neither will they, but it does mean we have to look at the balance of our food sources as well. Therefore, more UK production of fruit and vegetables is perfectly possible. Looking at the issues of the damage we do to our environment by flying vegetables in from all over the world when they could be produced here. There's a whole lot of issues surrounding that. But we also have to recognise that many people in this country are actually obese because of the poor quality food that they eat, or hungry because they can't afford to eat properly. So it is also about food pricing. And with our farms, yes, the farms are absolutely crucial to this. It is about extending biodiversity on our farms. It is about expanding headlands around fields. It is about rewilding part of it in order to strengthen our levels of biodiversity. If we go on damaging our soil at the rate we are, destroying the insect population at the rate we are, the levels of agricultural production will actually start to go down, not up.
It's an absolute myth, actually, that the IPCC report was somehow, advocating, moving away from meat and milk, the kind of produce that we produce in, a temperate, wet, largely wet climate like in Wales. Actually, animals fed on grassland make a positive contribution, because grass is one of the most important stores of carbon that we have. If you lose that, if you move away from that, actually you move to scrub, etc., then you actually lead to higher emissions as a result of that. The real message on food, right, is that we, all of us, as individuals, public authorities, schools, NHS, etc., we need to be buying more locally. Yep. We need to create local food systems producing the whole range, both of plant protein and animal protein, and stop importing it to the level
Jeremy
that we do.
Corbyn.
And farmers are an important part of the climate change that we want to create, because they are custodians of the environment, and we should be involving them as allies rather than decrying them as the enemy.
Just over a year ago, more than half of Labour MPs voted for Heathrow expansion. The Lib Dems voted against, Plaid Cymru voted against, the SNP abstained, and you cannot abstain on climate change. It's good that we're there now saying we need to limit the amount of aviation. The question now is how we share out the flights that we can take more fairly, and that does mean targeting those 15% of people who take 70% of all flights. These are the frequent flyers who need...
I'll let you answer in a moment, but Adam
by
Price.
the frequent flyer levy.
One airline was offering a £19 single ticket to go to Berlin. To go by train would have cost £240, and the rail infrastructure was totally invested in by the public. There has to be a much more efficient link-up of the Eurostar rail service with the whole of the rest of Europe in order to reduce the number of short-haul flights that go to Europe. And there has to be an expansion of our rail network all across the country if we're to get people to use trains rather than flights, and also make the train fares cheaper so that it's actually a real offer and option for everybody in this country.
So cheap flights to the Med have got to end, haven't they? All those holidays...
I think we do it better by offering a sensible alternative, which is also, and I'll finish on this point, also about improving bus services all across the country. They're pretty good in London. They're pretty poor in most other parts of the country. There has to be full regulation and demand for provision of adequate bus services all over the country to cut down on air pollution from cars.
And, after Scotland, I think Wales has got incredible renewable energy resources. And the great thing is, we were the cradle of the last industrial revolution. We could be there at the start of this new industrial revolution as well, if we tap into that potential. And the great thing is, as the entire world is looking at decarbonisation, if we get there earlier, if we get to 2030, we set that kind of target, of course, there are advantages then. We can reap the benefits of that, because if we solve the world's problems first, then we actually have created a new global industry which is economically useful for us, as well as helping us meet our environmental responsibilities earlier than anyone else.
Absolutely, Adam. I wholeheartedly agree. This is an opportunity for us as a country.
You announced 2 billion trees by 2040. Today, that's 100 million trees a year. How are you going to plant them? Where are you going to put them?
I'll leave you a copy of this afterwards.
Well, where are you going to put them?
Well, I'll leave you a copy of this afterwards, and this sets out in great detail the whole proposals we've made, both on tree planting
You didn't need to print
as
it
well,
off. I could have
as
looked
well
it
as on
online.
biodiversity. Yes, that tree planting will take place in national parks, in existing forests, and on farmland all across the country. We have the lowest level of tree cover of almost any country in Europe. It hasn't grown very much over the past 50 years or so, and it should have done.
So you will pay farmers to plant trees now?
We will do exactly that. We'll also be planting in new forests as well as the new national parks that we've proposed. We have to restore the levels of biodiversity in this country. Whole species of birds have completely disappeared. Sparrows, reduced. House martins, reduced. The cuckoo, almost unheard of in many parts of the country. That biodiversity eventually catches up with us and damages food production and farming itself. So it is about restoring peat bogs and salt marshes, which have been destroyed. It is about upstream river management, and that's why we want to bring the water industry into public ownership to work alongside the Environment Agency so that we do use upstream floodplains as a way of reducing flooding, as well as, of course, of flood protection. If we don't do this, then we're all damaged. Our plant life is damaged, our natural world is damaged, and eventually we're all damaged as a result of
Jo
that.
Swinson.
So, I mean, I think about my childhood and those types of birds that you would see in the garden.
Yeah.
You know, I think about bringing my children up, and I want them to be able to see that kind of wildlife. Hedgehogs, I remember having a little hedgehog box in the garden and putting out food for hedgehogs. You know, they've halved the hedgehog population in the last 20 years. I don't think my 5-year-old has actually seen a hedgehog. You know, we need to protect our amazing wildlife and biodiversity. So what do we need to do? We need to have strict legal targets and a Nature Act where we have very clear legally binding targets. We need to be able to enforce them. We'd have a new Office of Environmental Protection, and we need to invest. So we do need to plant those trees. We do need that to be in national parks. We also need to look at how we do that within our urban spaces and greening our cities.
What about the oil industry? I mean, the Greens say you've got to start decommissioning oil rigs, and you're resisting
Well,
that.
we're in the transition away from fossil fuels, and that transition has to accelerate. Scotland's, you know, one of the most renewable energy-rich countries in the world. If we were to stop tomorrow in terms of oil production, we would make ourselves more reliant on imports. The carbon intensity would increase. So that transition has got to be done in a way that cuts our emissions. But the one other thing that's not been mentioned here right now, which is where we've taken action and other countries haven't, is about the justice of the transition. Not doing this in a way that leaves people behind, that decimates people's jobs. We have a Just Transition Commission that's looking at how we do this transition fairly and justly, and that's really important as well. I grew up in the west of Scotland in the 1980s. I saw the effects of deindustrialisation and leaving people behind. The legacy of that is still there in too many of our communities, and we can't make that mistake again.
Huge numbers of people, especially children, are personally alarmed by the climate emergency and genuinely scared for their futures. I want to ask you all now, what is your personal climate change resolution to cut your carbon footprint? Nicola Sturgeon.
I'm already trying to do that. So in terms of how I heat my own home, you know, my energy provider is one that gets all its energy from renewable sources. Smart meter installed, trying to fly less myself. Sometimes it's inescapable in the job that I do, but trying to use the train much more when I'm coming to London, as I did today, for example, being much more conscious about what I eat and where I source the food that I eat from. So a whole host of things that I think it's really important that all of us lead by example on, because if we're asking other people to do these things, then it is simply not right that we don't do these things ourselves. We've all got to stop putting more plastics into our oceans, and that's why I think banning things like cotton buds, as we've already done, the deposit return scheme that we're introducing in Scotland, increasing the charge for single-use coffee cups, plastic bags, all of these things are important, and we've got to keep doing all of them and much more.
Your personal resolution, Jo Swinson.
Well, I try to do all of these small things as well, whether it's taking your keep cup, making sure you're doing the recycling. My campaign bus for this election is the first electric political
But we all need to do a
campaign
lot
bus.
more, don't we? That's
do.
the point of this.
And I will say that I think the most important thing that politicians can do is to put in place the policy frameworks, whether it's in terms of getting rid of single-use plastics much sooner, the regulations that are going to make it easier, because what we want to do is to make it easier and cheaper for everybody to do the right thing, so that the obvious decision to make is the one that is good for our climate.
Adam Price.
I'm going to start cycling to the Senedd every day. I'm going to shift from to an electric vehicle in the new year. And also, I convinced my partner as well, we're going to give a go with reusable nappies as well, to make our own small but important contribution.
You're going to wash them?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think that's the point. Yes.
No, I meant you. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I do change his nappies now, but the point is, for him and his generation, I want to do this.
Jeremy Corbyn, your personal resolution for the next generation?
To do everything I can to improve recycling systems in local authorities and elsewhere. There are, I think, 40 different local recycling schemes across the country, which means that we don't have a great record as a country on the world stage about recycling. Also, do everything I can to reduce the levels of excessive packaging, the waste of plastic with bubble wrap and all that goes with that.
What about your life?
Also,
what are you going to change about your life?
Well, my life...
It's beyond reproach, is it?
It's not. Nobody's life is beyond reproach. I'm always the last one to turn the heating on. In fact, we turned it on for the first time last week in my house, and that was very low temperature anyway, and I turned it off pretty quickly after that. I'm quite miserable, actually, on this basis, because I don't like to see the waste of energy that goes with it. And also, it is about... everybody can grow something if they've got a garden or a window box or whatever. You can grow appropriate plants which do improve biodiversity. Okay. So you can plant lavender or something which attracts bees and so on. So I do all of that in my garden and on my allotment and in my life.
Sian Berry.
I'm sorry, I've spent a lot of my life listening to politicians list green things they want to do and even list green policies. And it isn't about lists. So many of these pledges end up on a dusty shelf after we stop shining a light on them. And a light's on them today and they're saying an awful lot of things, but I just cannot sit back and watch this happen again. I mean, Greta Thunberg is only a teenager. She's already sick of hearing broken promises. Think how I feel at my age. Now, in my own life, I'm a private renter. I still do not have the ability to do my own home. So there's not a lot I can do, but I can carry on working to change the system. And it does need to be a comprehensive system change. The science demands it. The emergency demands it. And it isn't about listing things. It's about changing the way things work for good.